Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you all the principled, uncompromising case for the libertarian philosophy, the free society, free markets, private property, limited government. I'm doing a solo this week. I'm on the road, so a little different backdrop here. I'm in a hotel room, and I'm going to take this opportunity to talk to you about my favorite subject, the subject that I'm most passionate about, and that's my new book, An Encounter with Evil, the Abraham Zapruder Story. I hope, I know some of you have bought it. If you haven't yet bought it, hopefully this program will entice you into buying it and reading it. The common question I get is, Jacob, what difference does it make, the Kennedy assassination? Why should we care that thing happened, some 60 years ago or so? What possible relevance could it have to our lives today? And of course, then we also get the same thing that we've gotten for years of, it's just a conspiracy theory. There's no real facts here, Jacob, to establish that this was a regime change operation. So I want to talk to you a little bit about that because it is relevant. It's directly relevant to what's going on today, as you'll see in this program. And it has been established that it was through a regime change operation that President Kennedy was assassinated. And hopefully by the end of this program, you'll understand the context. And to get a deeper understanding of what's going on here, you can buy my book, An Encounter with Evil. When we talk about the Kennedy assassination, we inevitably run up against the national security establishment, the national security state. This is our form of governmental structure. It wasn't always our governmental structure. We started out as a limited government republic. That's the kind of system I favor. In fact, it's the kind of system that many libertarians favor. In fact, it's the mantra, it's part of the mantra that conservatives use. Any conservative that gives a speech, you can rest assured that he will always say, free enterprise, private property, and limited government. But the problem is that they don't really favor limited government. Because while that was our founding system, it is no longer our system and hasn't been our system since, the end of World War II or maybe a couple years after World War II, when the conversion took place to a national security state. Now, under a limited government republic, we had a relatively small, basic military force, enough to quell attacks by Native Americans on people that were settling out west and so forth, but certainly not large enough to embroil America in European wars that were really forever wars. They were always involved in conflicts. They still are always involved in conflicts, or Asian wars. There was a war against Mexico, but by wartime standards, it really wasn't a huge war. But after World War II, everything switches. The governmental structure switches in a very dramatic way. We get the Pentagon, permanent, gigantic building, okay? And we get what President Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex. Now, he had started out calling it the military-industrial Congressional complex because of the relationship that exists between the so-called defense industry, this army of defense contractors that are feeding at the public trough, and their relationship with Congress and how they all just reinforce each other. You see an example of this phenomenon with this $40 billion that they just sent to Ukraine. No questions asked, you see, no monitoring of where the money's going, man, just send it over there. And darn well, this is one of the most crooked regimes in the world, that there's a lot of Swiss bank accounts that are getting filled up with millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars. That's why they didn't want it monitored, because they need the votes of those Ukrainian officials to continue this proxy war that the Pentagon's waging now against Russia. And then you've got the CIA with its omnipotent dark side powers, assassination, which is expressly prohibited by the Fifth Amendment. And you've got the NSA with its massive secret surveillance, keeping files on people and so forth. So you've got this gigantic military intelligence component now. And so what was it that caused Americans to switch over to a national security state from a limited government republic, which had been our system for 150 years or so. Well, in every national security state, you've got to incite fear within the citizenry. Otherwise, there's no way to fleece them with this national security establishment, because this thing is a very expensive thing. I mean, you can just see, $40 billion taxpayer money just willy-nilly, send it on over. And the government's now in debt $30 trillion, but hey, what's another $40 billion? It's a drop in the bucket, right? Except that there's a lot of drops in the bucket, and they're mounting up to $30 trillion in debt. And the people who are getting fleeced are the American taxpayers. So you've got to figure out a way in a democratic system like this of getting the people who are being fleeced to support this, to be enthusiastic about it. And that's where the fear factor comes in, that a national security state always depends on scaring people, new official enemies every day, practically, that there's a constantly shifting array of official enemies, that they're coming to get us, they're coming to get us, they're coming to get us. I mean, it's like the communists and the terrorists and the drug dealers and the illegal immigrants and the Syrians and the Yemenis and the Afghans and the Taliban and the Iraqis, Saddam Hussein, and I mean, Ho Chi Minh, on and on and on, to keep people afraid so they can continue to support getting fleeced by this really warfare state type of governmental system. And that's what they did. When President Truman was in office, somebody said to him, Harry, you've got to scare the hell out of the American people if you're going to get this accomplished, because that's when the national security state came into existence. No constitutional amendment, mind you. I mean, this is a bigger transformation to a warfare state, a national security state, than even the transformation to a welfare state, which had been done under the Roosevelt administration. No constitutional amendment there either. But this was much bigger. You've got a huge permanent wartime economy now. And essentially, the country's at war on a permanent basis. And you'll recall what Madison said about war. Of all the enemies to liberty, war is the biggest, okay? Because it involves attacks on your own freedom and your own financial well-being, your monetary well-being, by your own government. That's what Madison said. He wasn't talking about war is the enemy of liberty because of these foreign threats, Russia, China, whatever. He's saying war is the enemy of liberty because of what your own government is doing to you. Well, the big bugaboo became communism, specifically Russia. Okay? So this thing is not new. This anti-Russia animus is nothing new. That's what justified the conversion to a national security state. Now, of course, it was the Soviet Union at that time, but Russia was the principal member. It was the driving force. And what they told Americans is that there was a international communist conspiracy that was based in Moscow to take over the world, and that therefore we're going to have to become like them. We need to start assassinating people. We need to torture people. We need all these powers, dark side powers, secret surveillance, massive permanent military establishments, spies, because otherwise we're going to fall to the communists. And they scared Americans to death that the Soviets were coming to get us. Now, it's ironic because on the Kennedy assassination, what do we always hear? Conspiracy, Jacob. It's a conspiracy theory, Jacob. It can't be that this happened. It has to be a conspiracy theory. And yet here you have the promoters of the Cold War, because that's what they called it, the Cold War, actually believing that there was this international communist conspiracy that was based in Moscow that was going to take over the world, including the United States. Gigantic conspiracy. Now, here's the irony about this. Now, this was the right wing that was doing it, but there were a lot of left wingers on board with this too. I mean, most everybody became a Cold Warrior, okay? But here's the thing about the conservatives. It's kind of funny, is that conservatives on economics will tell you, oh, socialism is an inherently defective system, Jacob. It's just inherently defective, and it is. I mean, it can't solve what the Austrian economists call the calculation debate. There's chaos, planned chaos under socialism. It doesn't produce the goods. There's a lot of times starvation. So the conservatives were right, but what was really funny is that they never understood or realized the contradiction in their own philosophy. Because on the one hand, they were saying, oh, socialism inherently defective, Jacob. But there was this international communist conspiracy based in Moscow that was threatening to take over the United States and the world. So here you've got this huge, successful conspiracy that's just about to take over America because, boy, there were communists in Hollywood and communists in the State Department and communists in Cuba, and they were coming to get us, you see. So in actuality, that never existed. That was just fear-mongering. But they had to make Americans afraid. Every national security state does. North Korea, it's a national security state too. It makes people afraid there. And the big bugaboo there is the U.S. government, the Pentagon, the CIA. Same in Cuba. And there's some justification, of course, given the aggressive nature of the U.S. regime, especially on regime change operations. But our big bugaboo was the communist threat, that the communists were coming to get us. And so you've got this intervention in the Korean War with no declaration of war, because we had to kill the Reds over there before the Reds got over here. And then, of course, there's the Vietnam War. 58,000 of my generation killed for no reason at all, wasted. And not to mention the large number of Korean people and Vietnamese people killed by U.S. Forces. And then you had, assassinations and so forth. Well, in the midst of all this, up to the time that the Cold War ostensibly ends, you have John Kennedy come into office. And Kennedy comes in as pretty much a standard Cold Warrior, and I go into this in my book in much more detail. But by the time the Cuban Missile Crisis had come about and the Bay of Pigs fiasco, where the CIA had set up Kennedy, they'd set him up, they'd lied to him, and he figured it out, and this is all detailed in my book, that by the time the Cuban Missile Crisis is over, Kennedy had achieved a breakthrough, and he realized this is just a racket, that these people are just engaged in racketeering, that it's all just a racket, this whole Cold War, this anti-Russia animus, the international communist conspiracy is just a bunch of bull. And so Kennedy says, by this time he held the whole national security establishment in disdain, and he says, we're not going to do it anymore. And this is what's so remarkable about his regime. Now notice you never see the mainstream press talking about this, because it's a difficult thing for them to deal with. Kennedy took on the entire national security establishment. It's essentially a war. I mean, we've published a book, JFK's War with the National Security Establishment, by Douglas Horne, who served on the Assassination Records Review Board. There was a war going on, a war that involved a conflict of visions. Will America move in this direction or that direction? And Kennedy said, no more Cold War. Essentially, it was in his peace speech at American University. He didn't use those words, but he said, we're not going to have this anti-Russia animus anymore. That's not going to be our driving force anymore. Shocking. I mean, he essentially ambushed the whole national security establishment. I think he had told one general in advance that he was going to do this, but the rest of them, they didn't know what the heck was coming. And he says, we're going to get along with the Soviets. Peaceful and friendly coexistence. Well, this is a shocker. And then he says, he starts ordering all the troops out of Vietnam. I mean, he achieved this breakthrough where he's going to move America in a totally different direction. He enters into a nuclear test ban treaty. The Pentagon, the CIA are furious. They're getting Congress to block it. Kennedy goes on the road and gets public opinion behind him. They pressure Congress to enact the treaty. And then he comes to the defense of the civil rights movement the night after his peace speech at American University. The civil rights movement was considered to be a communist front by those that were promoting this idea of an international communist conspiracy. They were going to be the front that was going to be the vanguard of this communist army that was supposedly going to take over the United States. So people say, oh, Jacob, that's no reason for them to take out Kennedy. Oh, really? Well, why do you think they targeted Jacobo Arbenz for assassination? He was the democratically elected president of Guatemala. And he said, I don't have anything to do with your Cold War. And he starts making friends with the Soviet Union, Russia, Cuba, and not Cuba. Castro hadn't come into power yet, but the Eastern Bloc countries. That's why they targeted him with assassination. They considered him a threat to U.S. national security. It was why did they assassinate Patrice Lumumba, leader of the Congo? Because he was leaning toward the communists. And there was no neutrality in their minds. It's like today. You cannot be neutral. It's either you're with us or you're against us. Salvador Allende, 10 years after the Kennedy assassination, they targeted him for a regime change operation that ended up leaving him dead. they orchestrated the kidnapping and assassination of the commanding general of Chile on the grounds that he was impeding a regime change operation. And their argument was to the national security establishment, their counterparts in Chile, is you have a duty, you have a moral duty to oust your president, to assassinate your president. And they did. They tried to assassinate him. It was a war, same kind of war that Kennedy was in. And Allende was fighting back, and they tried to assassinate him with high-powered bullets from high-powered weapons, rifles. They tried to assassinate him with missiles fired in from planes. So it was an actual war. And the idea was these are grave threats to national security. They concluded that Kennedy's rapprochement to the Soviets, and Kennedy was talking personally with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, trying to end this whole era of hostility, even though the Soviets were still controlling Eastern Europe and East Germany. Kennedy said, it's over. We're going to get along. And he actually praises the Soviet Union in his speech. So the battle lines were drawn. I mean, if they're going to assassinate Lumumba, if they're going to target Arbenz for assassination, if they're going to remove Mossadegh in Iran in '53 because he was leaning communist, if they're going to go after Castro for leaning communist. Remember, Cuba never attacked the United States, never did anything to the United States in an initiation of force sense, and they tried to assassinate Castro. That's just sheer murder. No different from murdering Allende or murdering Rene Schneider, the general in Chile who they kidnapped or tried to kidnap and then assassinated. These are all people that have never done anything adverse in a hostile way, in an initiation of force way against the United States. And so when I started studying the Kennedy assassination, and I look at it as a lawyer, because that's how I was trained, and once I realized that they had a fraudulent autopsy, that was it. It's case closed. Because you see, there's no innocent explanation for a fraudulent autopsy, and if there's one fact that's undisputed in the Kennedy assassination, it's the autopsy. That the Pentagon, the military, and I think most likely the CIA, was the only entity participating in that autopsy. And in my book, I explain, and also in my book, The Kennedy Autopsy, which I also highly recommend. That's our best-selling book at FFF ever. And then I wrote a supplement called The Kennedy Autopsy 2, detailing the fraudulent nature of this autopsy. Now, once you realize that the fraudulent nature of the autopsy, it's over, because there's no innocent explanation for a fraudulent autopsy. And since it's the military intelligence complex that controls the autopsy, that's it. That's how you know that this was a regime change operation, because there's no other explanation for a fraudulent autopsy. Now, if you get my book and you buy it, you'll understand that that's not the only place where fraud appears. There's also fraud that appears in what is now known as the Zabruder Film, and has been known as Zabruder Film for many decades. And you'll see my book. It revolves around a mystery in the Zabruder family. That's detailed in a book called 26 Seconds by Abraham Zapruder's granddaughter, Alexandra Zapruder. She talks about a taboo, a family taboo against discussing the film that lasted for, 40 years or so, 50 years. That you couldn't talk about it in the Zapruder family. And nonetheless, this film had a dramatic impact on this family, but they couldn't talk about it. And so she comes up with the reasons for this taboo. She doesn't call it a taboo. She says, no, we didn't have a taboo, but it was a code or a culture. Well, that's exactly what a taboo is. And she comes up with two ridiculous reasons for this that made no sense when I read her book. And I said, okay, I'm going to write a book. I'm going to figure this out first. And I spent a few months figuring out what was going on in this family. And I figured it out. And so my book revolves around this mystery of this family taboo. But in the process, you'll see the fraudulent nature of this film, and you'll see how I detail this and how I build it up. Now we're talking about circumstantial evidence here. We're not talking about a confession. You see, the people that cry, "Oh, conspiracy theory, Jacob, conspiracy theory," a lot of them won't even look at the evidence. I'll ask them, "Have you read my book, the Kennedy Autopsy," which is based on Doug Horn's book, 5-volume book, Inside the Assassination Records Review Board, which is the best Well, I think it's the second best book. The best book on the Kennedy assassination is JFK and the Unspeakable by James Douglas. If you don't know anything about the assassination, I recommend that. But there's a lot of people I've learned in life that I don't want to know about this, Jacob. It's a conspiracy theory. I don't want to delve into it. It's very frightening. The notion that there is a sense of evil, a structure of evil within one's own regime. You see, it's very easy to point at the Russians and say, look, evil, look, invasion. It's not so easy to say, oh, wait a minute, aren't they just copying what the Pentagon and the CIA did to Iraq? Aren't they just copying what the CIA and the Pentagon did to Afghanistan? They were in Afghanistan for 20 years killing people. I mean, that's a long time killing people. And they killed a lot of people. And they killed a lot of people in Iraq. Okay? And so that's much more difficult. And I go into this phenomenon in my book, is that what is it that precludes Americans from looking at the evil within their own regime? Because if the national security establishment really did assassinate leaders, which they did, wouldn't we want to do something about that? But no, as I point out in my new book, there's been this deference to authority. Assassinations are considered normal. They become a normal part of American life. I mean, America really has become a culture of death. Assassinations are legal, even though they're illegal under the Fifth Amendment. We got these 20-year occupation of Afghanistan, the invasion and occupation of Iraq, killing people that have never attacked the United States or even threatened to do so. You got Vietnam, you got Korea, you got any number of foreign interventions. Operation Condor, where the CIA was a partner in a top secret international assassination ring. And the war on terrorism. And, I mean, there's just a constant war, permanent war. You know, people look at these mass killings, like there's one in Uvalde, Texas, and you know there's been others recently, and they automatically say, oh, the problem is guns. Oh, it's just guns. Well, they got a lot of guns in Switzerland. In fact, I think practically every family is armed in Switzerland, armed to the teeth. I don't see these mass killings in Switzerland. But there's a culture of death here, and I have absolutely no doubts that this culture of death, where we're at permanent war, even right now, like pushing NATO all the way up to to Russia's borders, knowing full well what Russia was going to do. Russia's been telling them for 25 years. You've been pushing up closer and closer, even though you promised not to when the Cold War was over. But you've been absorbing these Eastern European countries. The red line is Ukraine. We're not going to let you do Ukraine because that means nuclear missiles pointed at Moscow, St. Petersburg, and other Russian cities from just a few minutes away. And that's precisely what the U.S. position is with respect to Cuba. You remember that's what the Cuban Missile Crisis was about. President Kennedy, the Pentagon, the CIA took the position, you're not going to put nuclear missiles there. And their position was, we're just trying to deter you from attacking again, because the CIA and the Pentagon were pressing Kennedy to attack and invade Cuba. Just like Russia. I mean, this was so ironic, is they're pontificating about how evil Russia is for invading Ukraine. This is what they were. Well, they invaded Cuba at the Bay of Pigs through a proxy army, same kind of proxy army that they're using in Ukraine to wage war against Russia. But they were pressuring Kennedy to attack and invade Cuba because of these nuclear missiles that were 90 miles away. Well, that's what Russia's position is. And they told him for 25 years, we don't want nuclear missiles on our borders too. Well, the U.S. pushes them all the way up there and threatens to absorb Ukraine. And so now you've got Russia invading, which they said they were going to do. You've got thousands of Russian troops killed, all for no reason at all. All the U.S. had to do was, all they had to do was dismantle NATO at the end of the Cold War. This was a Cold War dinosaur. The whole idea of NATO was to protect Western Europe from a supposed attack by the international communist conspiracy that was represented by Moscow, which is ridiculous in and of itself. At the end of World War II, Russia was decimated. Their entire industrial base. The Nazis came within an inch of conquering Russia. And so at the end, they had lost countless millions of people. I forget how many millions, but the thought that the Soviet Union was going to start a new war against Western Europe is so ludicrous. They didn't have the manpower, they didn't have the industrial might, and they would be facing the United States because inevitably the interventionists would have said the U.S. has to be involved in this. Well, they were already in West Germany and so forth. And then, facing a nuclear power with the willingness to use nuclear bombs on populated cities, as the Japanese found out, NATO was ridiculous from the very beginning. And it should never have been brought into existence, but it should never have stayed in existence at the ostensible end of the Cold War. But for the Pentagon and the CIA, as we are learning now, the Cold War never ended. They never lost their anti-Russia animus. And so as they're moving NATO gradually over the last 25, 30 years or so eastward, you can tell their animus is against Russia. Well, also against Cuba. Don't forget that they're still waging war against Cuba with this brutal embargo. Right now there's Cuban people who they can't get milk. And they're very close to starvation, to extreme malnutrition. They're having the worst economic crisis in decades, maybe ever. And yet the U.S., the conservatives are exultant over this, and so are many of the liberals, because remember, this is what the purpose of the embargo, to target the Cuban people with death, malnutrition, starvation, so that they'll rise up and oust the Castro regime and install another pro-U.S. dictator like Fulgencio Batista. Never mind that he was a crooked, corrupt, brutal guy himself, but he was right-wing. He was a crony capitalist, and so that makes him a pro-freedom fighter. And that's what this is all about. But notice that the anti-Cuba animus never left the Pentagon and the CIA. They're not about to lift this embargo to help out these Cuban people. Now, sure, socialism contributes to this. It's like a vice. The socialist system and the embargo squeezing the life out of the Cuban people, but they don't care. I mean, look, they killed hundreds of thousands of Iraqi people with their sanctions there. Children, not just people, children. Remember when Madeleine Albright, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, told 60 Minutes that the deaths of 500,000 Iraqi children were worth it. And by worth it, she meant regime change, getting rid of Saddam Hussein, who was another official enemy. So you can see all the official enemies that we've had. The communists, when the ostensible end of the Cold War happened, they go into the Middle East. They panicked during that interim before the war on terrorism. When people were talking about the peace dividend, which meant drastic reducing the budgets of the national security establishment, they said, no, we can do the drug war. We can help stabilize the world, which is a joke, But in the meantime, they go into the Middle East knowing full well what the reaction was going to be, the Persian Gulf War, the sanctions against Iraq, killing those children, unconditional support to the Israeli regime, putting U.S. troops near Islamic holy lands. It was like a boiling cauldron. And finally, there's the terrorist blowback, and now they're off and running again. Now they got the global war on terrorism. Terrorism replaces communism, but not really, because they still got China, okay? And they still are moving eastward, remember, with NATO. But now that they got evicted out of Afghanistan, and they're occupying Iraq still, but they're not killing people in mass. They're still killing people, but it doesn't have the force of producing this great big terrorist thing that's going to strike fear in people. Like, people have lost their fear of, oh my gosh, the terrorists are coming to get us, the terrorists are coming to get us. But now they're going full circle. Now, the other factor in this, the big fear factor that goes on in national security states, is that when you've got an empire, and you're the strongest empire, the biggest empire, which the U.S. was at the end of the Cold War, the Soviet Union was decimated, disintegrated. Russia ends up a second-rate power. And we see that in Ukraine. You see, this is sort of their worst nightmare, because they were trying to portray Russia as the new enemy, the new official enemy that was going to replace the global war on terrorism. Well, they're coming to get us. The Russians are coming. They're going to take over Eastern Europe. They're back. They're going to take over Western Europe. They're going to take over South America, the world, the United States. They can't even conquer Ukraine. They're a second-rate power, but one with nuclear weapons, which makes it very dangerous and very reckless, because you never know what somebody's going to do when they're pressed and they got their backs pressed. But you see, there's another factor that you need to consider here, that the U.S. wants to be the only empire. And when they were mired down in Afghanistan and Iraq, they were spending money out the gazoo, or, we've got this $30 trillion in debt, and a large portion of that debt is the warfare state. And that's where the inflation's now coming in. They got to finance this debt. They got to finance all this spending. They got to print the money to do it because they're scared to tax people to pay it off. So during this period of time, the 20 years that they're killing people in Afghanistan, they're spending money out the gazoo, China wasn't involved in any wars at all. And they liberalized their economy. They were booming. They were making friends with people. They were building these socialist dams in Latin America and Africa and stuff. The Russians were not engaged in any wars, so they're starting to prosper. Well, they saw this, you see, and for an empire, this is anathema. And this is the way it's worked throughout history, that when an empire is the strongest and it sees a rising opponent, and the mainstream press played into this. Remember that during this period of time, the mainstream press would refer to China and Russia as enemies, rivals, opponents, competitors, adversaries. Why? I mean, just because they're prospering? I mean, why should we begrudge another nation because it's prospering? But that's the mindset of an imperialist. And so when that trade war with China got started, and they persuaded Trump to initiate that thing, it was with the idea of degrading China. You see, bringing them down. Now, it degrades the U.S. too. I mean, that hurt American farmers, put a lot of them into bankruptcy. They had to go on welfare. And we're still suffering the effects of that trade war. But you see, it doesn't degrade the United States as much as it does China, because China's at a lower economic level. They don't have the giant base of prosperous taxpayers that the U.S. government has. And so while it degrades us, let's say, by 25%, it degrades them by 60%. And that's worth it. Because then the same thing with Russia, that Russia was rising, and so we've got to figure out a way to degrade Russia. And so that's when the final push comes in. We're going to absorb Ukraine. We're going to put our nuclear missiles there. We're going to claim Crimea. And Russia goes to war, and now Russia's degraded. So is the United States. I mean, as you can tell, more and more money is being added to this debt. Prices are soaring because of monetary debasement and so forth. Well, the point of all this is that this is no way to live. Okay? I mean, we're closer to nuclear war than we've been ever, maybe even ever, but at least since the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's a reckless foreign policy, and there was no need for it. Absolutely no need. There was no need for Ukraine to join NATO. There was no need for NATO to be existing. But this is where we are under a national security state, a constantly shifting array of official enemies. Saddam Hussein, the communists, the Reds, the terrorists, the illegal immigrants, the drug dealers, the Russians, the Chinese. It goes on and on. This is no way to live. And our ancestors understood that. That's why they had a limited government republic. And this would be an ideal time for a limited government republic. We've been indoctrinated with this notion that the Pentagon, the CIA, and the NSA are keeping us safe. This is bull. They are keeping us unsafe, and they are the destroyers of our liberty. They are the great destroyers of our liberty. You can't be free in a society where they have omnipotent dark side powers of assassination, torture, indefinite detention, secret surveillance. This is a communist type system. It's not a free type system where you've got limited government. And this is what we're living under. But it's not necessary, and this is the relevance of the Kennedy assassination, and this is why I exhort you to get my book, because there's a way out of this, and Kennedy was pointing that way, which is why they had to deal with him, and that this is just racketeering. It's a great big racket. This whole anti-Cuba animus, anti-Russia animus, anti-China animus, it's all generated, and sometimes the crises are generated by the fear-mongering people within the national security establishment. But if they don't incite the crisis, they seize upon the crisis. And in the meantime, we get fleeced. And hopefully it stops there, that we're not incinerated with out of control nuclear war, because you just never know. But there's a way out of this. You see, and our ancestors pointed that way through our founding principles, sound founding principles. I'm not talking about the bad founding principles of this country, slavery and women's rights and so forth. I'm talking about the good founding principles, and one of the best was a limited government republic. And so Kennedy's pointing out, this is a racket, and we're going to put a stop to it. And that's why his regime is so significant. Now, there's a lot of bad things about the Kennedy administration, okay? And people can point to personal faults on the part of President Kennedy himself. Irrelevant. What we're talking about here is Kennedy pointed the way to this racket and how to get out of this racket, to stop this animus. And they had to be dealt with because he was going to win the 1964 election. There's no question he would have beat Goldwater, just like Johnson ended up smashing Goldwater. That meant he had another year and then another 4 years, 5 years to implement this vision. At this point in time, the national security establishment would have been twiddling their thumbs. There would have been no Cold War, no hostilities, no anti-communist animus, no anti-communist crusade, none of this stuff. And then there's a good chance his brother Bobby would have followed up with 8 more years. So this is why they considered him a grave threat to national security, not to mention the fact, a grave threat to them. Because if you restore a limited government republic, which is precisely what we need to do, you don't have any need for a national security state anymore. There is no country in the world today, or even in the near future, that has the remotest capability of invading and occupying the United States. It just cannot happen. Nobody's got the manpower. Nobody's got the money. Nobody can do the supply lines. Russia can't even conquer Ukraine. Okay? There's no way China could cross the Pacific Ocean with enough army and manpower, supply lines, and so forth. It can't happen. Now they say, oh, this is isolationism. Well, actually, it's an interesting term they use, because what they're doing with their sanctions and their embargoes and their trade restrictions and their trade wars is they're isolating the private sector. See, they are the isolationists, and they're unleashing the national security establishment, Pentagon, CIA, and NSA. We libertarians want to do the opposite. We want to unleash the private sector. Open borders, free trade, open immigration, freedom of travel, freedom of association. You want to go to Cuba? You're free to go to Cuba. That's your natural God-given right. Freedom of travel, freedom of association, economic liberty, freedom of trade. So we want to unleash the private sector, which are our best diplomats, not the people in the State Department, and rein in the U.S. government. Okay, leash them in by restoring a limited government republic. My book is called An Encounter with Evil: The Abraham Zapruder Story. If you like it, please leave. Whether you like it or not, please leave a review on Amazon. If you do like it, please refer the book to your friends.